In this video, I'm going to do a walkthrough of the slides for Unit 5, Day 12, and Day 13. In the second video of this series, I'm going to do a walkthrough of the Google Doc that accompanies these slides, along with some answers to the questions that students are asked. Before we get into the focus question and the learning objective, there are a couple of important note to teacher slides, and I want to make sure to point things out on them. The first is that there are depictions of violence and derogatory language. There's also some pretty graphic language in these primary sources that are in this lesson. Make sure to give the students context for these. Definitely be careful, and I'm going to point out a few instances of this throughout the slides. The second thing to make sure is, just like the Japanese internment lesson, this is hard history. It's one of the worst events in the world history. Facing History has a variety of resources for you before you enter into this lesson. And you can see those links in the slides themselves. So I'm going to walk through the format of the lesson and what happens, and give some tips for teaching it. The focus question is a new focus question this week. It's, how did World War II reshape the global balance of power? And this lesson is really your introduction to the Cold War, because now we're going to be talking about nuclear war and what that means for the United States' role in America, or in the world, sorry. The lesson objective is to explain the implications of the United States' decision to drop the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Students will first debate whether the bomb should be dropped, and then they will look at the aftermath and the effects of it. So for the introduction model here, you've got a chart showing casualties and a map showing battles in the Pacific Theater. Check out my video, my student-facing video that includes this section in it, to see some discussion points and some key details. And also check out the next video in the series where I'll talk a little bit more about it. A little bit more context given to students on this slide, just about the Manhattan Project and the Potsdam Declaration, and also the idea of unconditional surrender, which are key ideas in this content. So this is introducing what students are going to be doing for the next few slides, which is advising President Truman on whether he should be using the atomic bombs. And students are going to look at the advantages and disadvantages of all of the choices facing the president and the military at this time. So you can decide how you want to do this. If you want to lead it synchronously, have students work with you on it. You might do one on your own, or have students jump into it. You might do them all together. It's really up to you and where your class is at. The mini lesson video, the student-facing mini lesson video, does do the first question together, the first possible choice together, and then it has students continue on their own. If you want to use that mini lesson video, it's available for you. So once you have read this introduction, or students have read this introduction, and then they've also read this second part of it, they're going to look at the possible choice of invading Japan with American and British troops. This would have been the traditional warfare, not using the atomic bomb, simply invading with troops. And so students should be thinking about, based on their reading, what were the advantages and disadvantages of this possible choice. And this is a pretty straightforward one. The advantages would have been that the U.S. military at this point was strong, the British military was strong, and they would have probably been very successful militarily in a ground invasion. The disadvantages, based on the sentence up here, is that it would result in almost 200,000 casualties and about 40,000 deaths. If you model this slide for students, then they'll get a good understanding of what to do here in writing the advantages versus disadvantages. And they're just continuing this for each of the following ones, looking at the possible choice and what are the advantages and disadvantages. Once they've done that, they're then going to write a memo to President Truman, explaining the advantages and disadvantages of each of the potential scenarios for ending the war with Japan, and they can take a position here. And that's the wrap-up. That's the end of the day 12. So the wrap-up doesn't include a question for the students. It's just some information that tells them what ended up happening and leading into the next lesson. In the next lesson, students are going to be exploring the effects of the bombs, and they're going to see if that changes what their choice was in the previous lesson. I did want to say that this slide does have one of the offensive terms in it. If you look at the news article here, so if you're going to keep this image in, make sure to discuss the term with students, because it is not an appropriate term for anybody to be using. There are several texts which are pretty lengthy here. So if you're modifying this for your lesson, you might choose which text to remove and which to keep in. And for each text, there is a single question for them to be answering on the slides. So if you want to take a look at some answers, you can check out the next video, which talks more about this. But they are looking at primary source reflections of the bombings, both from the Japanese perspective and then also from the American perspective, from the people who were in the plane that dropped the bombs. So once students have answered all 4 of the questions, analyzed all 4 documents, and answered all 4 questions, they'll be thinking about whether this impacts their decision yesterday, or from the previous lesson, and that's the independent work for the lesson. The wrap-up includes a reflection by President Truman, where he talks about that he doesn't regret any of his decisions because it saved American lives. And students will just be answering a reflection question on that. And then there is also an additional wrap-up here, which discusses potential questions around the debate of using the bomb. This is a good place for a discussion, or you can use this as an additional wrap-up question if you want students to write their answers. And the last slide is a check for understanding, in which they are going to kind of be jumping into the idea of the Cold War, thinking about how these 2 bombs had such a big effect. And they're gonna go into a lot more detail on this later on in the Cold War units. So check out the next slide for some more answers and another way of delivering this material to students.